Welcome back to Kevin's Blue Ribbon Baking and Canning. I'm your host, Kevin Holland, and boy, do we have an exciting show for you today. I know you've all been anxious to get started in your sourdough bread journey, so let's get right to it. I'm going to introduce some of the ingredients, but I don't want you to worry about the proportions or anything specific about the recipe. I'll have the recipe posted in the comments section, and feel free to put a comment or a question on the channel if you have any questions about anything that comes up during the program. So obviously, right down to it, we're going to have bread flour. This recipe uses 900 grams of bread flour, which I've already measured out. Bread flour is preferable to any other flour because it has a higher protein content, which will give you more gluten development and a better structure to your bread. If you don't have 100% bread flour, if you mix in with all-purpose flour, that's fine too. And again, very simple ingredients. We have 630 grams or milliliters of water, 16 grams of salt, and we're going to be using 200 grams of Ivanka. Now, you remember Ivanka from last show. She's our sourdough starter, and you'll get to see her in action today. First thing we're going to do as part of this very easy, simple process is incorporate the starter into the water, make a mixture, and then we're going to just add by hand the flour into the bowl. So here we go. Remember on the previous show we talked about the importance of having a digital scale, so we're going to weigh out the starter carefully, 200 grams. But before we put Ivanka in here, we want to make sure that you get a good look at that she's ready to go. I fed her last night about midnight. She's had about 8 hours to go, and she's really up and bubbly, so perfect for baking this morning. 200 grams. There she goes. Perfect. 200 grams on the dot. Now, pro tip. Take your starter and the water, which you already have pre-mixed. There, I spilled my salt a little bit. You already have pre-mixed. Go ahead, take the starter and put it directly into your water bowl. Scrape her out here. You'll note that the starter is floating in the water. That means that the gas bubbles are there. She's built up her structure and she is ready to go. Simply taking a bowl scraper, we're going to mix the starter in with the nice warm water. Now, a lot of people have asked in the past, what kind of water do you use? Do you have to use distilled water? Do you have to use bottled water? It's simply not necessary. I just use tap water here, so it's not a major concern. You can see as I'm slowly, gently mixing the starter in, it's getting a nice milky consistency. You just want to break up the structure of the starter a little bit. It'll make it easier to incorporate into the flour. There we go. And the next step, we're going to take our 900 grams of bread flour and slowly, carefully add it into the sourdough starter mixture and water. And by hand with our bowl scraper, again, we're going to incorporate the flour in. I'm going to do this a little bit at a time, mainly because my bowl is not really large enough to take all of this. And we'll put the rest of the flour in. Now we're not kneading the dough at this time. We're simply mixing it, incorporating the water and the starter mixture into the flour. Doing it nice and slow, taking our time. The dough scraper that fits the contour of your bowl. It's very helpful if you can get one of those. And again, this isn't a thorough kneading or a thorough mixing. This is simply the initial incorporation of the flour into the starter and water mixture. At this point, we're pretty good. Have you take a look at that. Our next step in the process is we're going to let this mixture rest. It's called the Autolease period. This allows the flour to fully incorporate the moisture and the starter into the mixture. At the completion of the 30-minute period, Autolease period, we'll take our 16 grams of salt and we'll incorporate that and begin our bulk proof. Okay, folks, we've waited our 30-minute Autolease time. We've added our 16 grams of salt, and now we're ready to do our first stretch and fold. Here's our dough at this point. You notice that I've used the shower cap that I mentioned on the last show. That'll keep your moisture in while you're doing your bulk proofing and Autolease period. And now we're ready to do our first set of stretch and folds. Before we get started, though, I do want to mention about your baking schedule when it comes to sourdough. You want to make sure that you give yourself plenty of time to prepare and plan accordingly. So day one, you're going to have your first period of building your starter up, feeding your starter, doing your discards. Probably the evening before, you want to head and do the feeding. The next morning, you'll be ready. Your starter will be ready. That's when you're going to do your mixing, your Autolease period, and your initial set of stretch and folds. That's probably an hour time period during the day, but you'll have to come back to the stretch and folds every 45 minutes. So it's going to take about 4 hours out of your day. The next day, after you do your bulk proofing in the refrigerator, you're going to do your pre-shaping, your shaping, your scoring, and your baking. So again, give yourself, on day 3, give yourselves about 4 hours of time. Before we get started with the stretch and folds, you notice that I've got my silicone mat that we also talked about in our previous show. Before we put the dough down, we want to make sure that we get the mat and our hands really wet. You don't want to use a lot of flour when you're doing this initial stretch and fold step. So I'm wetting my hands. Get a good coat down on the silicone mat. We'll do our initial turn out of the dough. Now the first thing you're going to notice is the dough at this stage before our stretch and folds, it's very wet. That's why wet the surface that you're working on. Simply give your dough a nice little stretch and start the folding process. 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees. Flip. Stretch out. Over. And done. And you notice we're being very gentle with the dough. We're not punching it down, being very gentle. Getting that stretch. You see the stretch here. This is building gluten, which is going to give you your structure and build to the sourdough. You can see it's getting some gluten development already. We'll give it another stretch and fold. Over. Great. Now we're going to put this back in the bowl in the proofer, and we'll come back 45 minutes later. We'll do another stretch and fold. We'll come back 45 minutes after that, do another stretch and fold, and then we're going to take our dough and do the bulk proofing in the refrigerator overnight.